Welcome to the first episode of Obsessed with Adam Strauss. I'm Adam Strauss. I'm a comedian. I do solo shows, and I also happen to have obsessive compulsive disorder. And I'm fascinated by obsession in both its obviously pathological forms like OCD, but also what I might call subclinical forms, the more everyday forms of obsession, because even those are a double-edged sword. They can take over in a way that can be unhealthy, but also a degree of this, I think, is essential to go really deep down any particular rabbit hole in any specific field. And so on Obsessed with Adam Strauss, I'll be talking to people from various spheres, artists, athletes, scientists, collectors, people who have gone extremely deep down one area. And the goal is to learn about their obsession, but also seek to understand why they are obsessed with this particular thing, because I think that reveals a lot about ourselves. And for this first episode, I'm thrilled to be joined by Hamilton Morris. Hamilton is a journalist and a scientist who is, I think it's no exaggeration to say, obsessed with psychedelics. He's also, in full disclosure, a close personal friend, someone who I have known since 2007. And when I met Hamilton then, he was, I think, 19, and he was already very clearly obsessed with psychedelics. He had just started publishing some articles. And today we're going to be talking about a specific area, which is the FDA, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration's recent rejection of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. MDMA, of course, is the psychoactive compound in what is commonly known as ecstasy or Molly. It had widely been expected to receive FDA approval, but to many people's shock, the FDA ultimately rejected this therapy. Now, this episode was recorded right before that rejection came down the pipeline. It was recorded after an FDA advisory committee recommended against approval, but at a time there was still some hope that the FDA might discard their advisory committee's recommendation and actually approve this therapy. But as we learned a few days after Hamilton and I recorded this, that unfortunately is not what came to pass. The standard line of thought among many in the psychedelic community, including myself before I spoke to Hamilton, was that unfortunately MAPS, the Multidisciplinary Association of Psychedelic Study, and Lykos, its pharmaceutical arm, had unfortunately dropped some not terribly significant but ultimately fatal balls in going through the FDA approval process. They failed to do some very basic but required safety testing. But Hamilton explodes this idea. There were no drop balls, according to Hamilton. What happened instead was something far more nefarious and, I dare say, far more interesting. As you'll hear on this podcast, there was, and I use this word with some caution, but I think it's accurate, a conspiracy. A small number of people did everything they could to sink this therapy, and shockingly, they succeeded. And this is, I believe, an unmitigated tragedy. PTSD is at times a fatal condition with a very high suicide rate. This is unquestionably the most promising therapy we have. And the implications of this, I don't think, can be overstated. This is not just about PTSD. This is not just about MDMA. This sets back the movement for psychedelic therapies a long time, certainly years. So if you're interested in the reasons, the real reasons why this therapy got shot down, then I think you'll enjoy this episode. So here's Hamilton Morris.
Because I think drug dependence in and of itself has a sort of disempowering effect and begets more drug dependence and more compulsive behavior.
Yeah. First, we should probably do an intro because we're already into it. So this is Obsessed with Adam Strauss, but this one is obviously with Hamilton Morris. And I say obviously, even if people aren't watching the video, I think you have a very distinctive voice. And I just got back into New York briefly, and I texted you just to hang out, and you responded, "Let's hang out." And then you immediately asked me, you said, "Do you have any inside intel about the MDMA FDA thing? I'm obsessed." Yeah, the whole MAPS, MDMA, I was going to say rejection. It hasn't been rejected, but an FDA advisory panel recommended against approval of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD.
Yes, overwhelmingly.
Overwhelmingly. It was like 9-2 or something.
Something like that, yeah.
And the blanket rationale was that we don't think the benefits outweigh the potential harms. Is that correct?
That's the idea.
Yeah. So tell me about why you're obsessed about this and what you think is going on.
There's so much going on. And I think that many people dramatically overestimated how easy this would be. Like they saw this medicalization as a train that was slowly moving forward. And now that people were doing the real scientific research, it was just a matter of time before the inevitable acceptance of psychedelics or psychedelic adjacent compounds like MDMA as medicines. And
yeah, I mean, and to be honest, when I hear you saying that, what comes up for me is like, yeah, I'm certainly was in that camp.
Yeah.
It did feel absolutely inevitable.
Yeah.
Particularly the way that MAPS and, Rick Doblin really engineered it in a very way that seemed very savvy, which is, all right, let's focus on veterans and first responders, people who are so sympathetic and certainly cut across the aisle in terms of Republicans want to support the troops, people who might traditionally be more skeptical or opposed to psychedelics. It just felt like it was very well conceived to maximize the chance of acceptance, and you have a condition where conventional treatment just is not effective for many, many people. And yeah, I did think it was inevitable.
Yeah. Yeah, the whole thing was brilliant. It maximized bipartisan support. It didn't alienate conservatives. It sidestepped issues of the cost of treatment by emphasizing a patient population that would be treated by the VA.
Yeah.
And really, the whole thing was, and a very vulnerable patient population that was at a disproportionately high and extraordinary risk for suicide.
Yeah.
And so really it ticked all the boxes. It was a good thing to do. It looked good. It had good logistical dimensions baked into it. The whole thing was very smart, and the results were extraordinary.
Yeah.
And at least for me, it's hard to overestimate how significant all of this was. I think I almost took it for granted, and I'm certainly on the very much on the positive side of all of this, but even I would sometimes, have a little bit of a skeptical attitude toward medicalization, thinking that people, my main concern was more of a philosophical one, that anytime you medicalize something, then that actually impacts the very way that people conceptualize the substance and impacts the nature of the experience itself.
Yeah.
And I saw this, you see this all the time with people. Instead of saying like, I want to trip on mushrooms, they say, I've been depressed. I want to see if mushrooms will help me.
Yeah.
And I've just noticed that became increasingly common in tandem with medicalization. And, there's just these little moments, like in one of the episodes of the second season of my show, I was talking with this cop who had busted a big MDMA lab, or actually technically it was an MDA lab, but they were, kind of doing the typical cop thing and saying, it's good we got these drugs off the street. These are very dangerous drugs. And I got to have my little gotcha moment and say, well, actually, they're entering phase 3 clinical trials right now as a treatment for PTSD, and the results are very promising. And that became the kind of default objection to somebody saying that psychedelics were dangerous. You say they're dangerous. If they're so dangerous, then why are all these doctors at prestigious universities evaluating them as treatments for disease if they're so dangerous? And it was really a good thing. And
yeah.
And I even remember talking with someone, a former MAPS employee, who told me that she felt like her work was done, like it was on autopilot. It was time to move on to new projects because, of course, it's going to be approved. How on earth could it not be approved? And then terrible things began to unfold. I mean, one was that throughout this medicalization initiative, there has been a stream of weird stuff going on with various interests. I've seen it a lot with Compass, and I'm not working with Compass anymore. Nothing bad happened, just my contract with them expired. but a lot of people would accuse me of being a PR agent for Compass or saying complimentary things about them because I was working with them or they were funding research that I was doing. And
this episode is sponsored by Compass. For all your psychedelic needs, go to compass.com/Hamilton for 10% off. And check out our monthly subscription plans.
There you go.
Sorry, go on.
But the reality was that, if anything, I was saying less because of that. I was tempering my criticism because I didn't want any of it to blow back on Compass.
Yeah.
So I was extremely opinionated about things that I was seeing, but was holding my tongue because I had a legitimate conflict of interest. A legitimate argument could have been made that it was inappropriate for me to comment on these issues. And it put me in a very difficult position because nobody else was saying the things that I was observing. I was observing very troubling things happening, and it was very hard.
Sorry, and troubling things, you don't mean within Compass, but with MAPS more, or?
I mean culturally and journalistically. So...
Oh, I see. So people could have said, oh, he's just saying that because he's trying to defend Compass?
Yes.
Right. So you felt like you wouldn't have credibility to call out these concerning things you were seeing in areas of the psychedelic movement ecosystem, whatever we want to call it.
Right. And I was shocked and dismayed by how nobody else was saying anything, that bad things were happening and no one else was mentioning it.
Let's talk about them now.
Yeah. So, the first kind of phase of this was that Catherine McLean had this major falling out with Compass and was friends with this journalist, Olivia Goldhill, who wrote the first anti-Compass expose.
There's the long article she wrote where it was like quoting Catherine extensively.
Yeah.
I think the substance of this article was saying Compass had represented that this was going to be like a nonprofit, and then suddenly they cut us off, they stopped communicating with us, they took all of our knowledge and announced that this was now a for-profit company.
Yes, that was the argument.
Yeah.
And...
well, it wasn't an argument in this article. It was presented as, source reporting.
Right. I think there's aspects of this that they're presented as if they're bad things, but I don't think that they are bad things.
Yeah.
So, for example, it's widely considered a bad thing that they switched from being a nonprofit to a for-profit. I don't think that's a bad thing at all.
Yeah.
If the point is to achieve a goal, which is pushing psilocybin through clinical trials as a treatment for depression.
Well, it's also worth noting that MAPS now has made the same. I mean, it wasn't quite. How would you?
They splintered into a for-profit entity, Lycos, a pharmaceutical division, and again, I don't see anything
functionally similar. I would say what Compass did for the same reasons, according to Rick Doblin too. That in this, the way to scale is through capitalism, and we need to avail ourselves of the
only way. I mean, Rick Doblin really fucking tried.
Yeah.
He really
to just
really
purely
tried.
go the nonprofit route.
And if he couldn't pull it off
decades,
for 40 years,
yeah.
I mean, he sold MDMA to pay for legal defense to prevent it from being scheduled in the first place. He did everything in his power, and the reality is that this is a very expensive process.
Yeah.
And I see absolutely nothing wrong with MAPS becoming for-profit. I also have no stake in this game. I might conceivably be annoyed if I donated millions of dollars of my own money to MAPS with the assumption that I was doing this so they could maintain a nonprofit status.
Yeah.
That, if I were in that position, I think anyone who donated millions of dollars to them has a reason to be critical, but that's not the majority of the criticism. It's not coming from people who are like, what the fuck? I gave Rick $2 million. That's not where it's coming from. It's coming from a kind of nebulous anti-corporate fear that isn't really attached to any realistic problems, but there's a concern, a sense of badness.
I think part of it is the fact that MDMA is not protected by patent. Psilocybin is not protected by patent. So I think part of the concern is, wait, these companies are going to profit off this stuff that, especially in the case of psilocybin, like this is nature bequeathed this to us. And in the case of MDMA, it was first synthesized by Bayer in the 1870s or something, like stuff that's been, or 90...
Probably I think it's maybe sometime around 1920.
Okay, but stuff that has been in the effectively public domain for billions of years or 100 years, right? I think part of it is, there are many valid criticisms of capitalism, and so there is a concern about anything moving from a nonprofit to a capitalist model. But I think part of it is also working with these compounds that, rightly or wrongly, people are saying, no, this is all of our birthright.
Right, but that's not a real thing. Like,
right,
this is a fake problem.
Right, because the FDA is not approving psilocybin or MDMA. They're approving a specific protocol, a specific formulation, and this is part of what has to happen in order to get sufficient funding to scale this stuff.
And someone else can sell a different polymorph or a different salt or any number of things. I mean, anyone that has even passing familiarity with the way patents work knows that you can essentially patent anything and you can essentially evade a patent for anything with sufficient funds.
Really? Okay. This is interesting.
I would say so.
Yeah. Because you can develop an isomer or something that is not going to infringe upon that patent, but that is functionally similar enough.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah. So all of this to me is an inconsequential game that lawyers play.
Yeah.
And I think that both of us probably interact with a lot of people who are just becoming interested in psychedelics, who are at the level of having read about psychedelics for hours.
Yeah.
Like their entire psychedelic education.
Or seen Michael Pollan's series on Netflix,
or even just hearing about it. So they're, microdosing. I heard about, I knew of someone that microdosed. They said that you can microdose as a thing.
Yeah.
So I interact with people like that all the time.
Yeah.
And what I see interacting with these people is that they do not have a deep understanding of this subject, and people are frightening them with a hypothetical problem that is a problem we are incredibly lucky to have. And if this FDA hearing proves anything, it is that. The fact that we should be arguing about, Lykos patented a particle size of a MDMA formulation. So what? Are there other people that have developed that exact same particle size of an MDMA formulation who are being prevented from prescribing this to veterans right now? Absolutely 100% not even close. And so this is not a real issue. It would be like if a child said that they were afraid of the boogeyman killing them while they slept, and you said, well, sometimes crazy people have invaded homes with children and have killed them.
This is the proper way to respond to a child.
It is a thing that has happened, and we need to have a conversation about how there are boogeymen-like people that do kill children. It's just not. It's not when people are going to prison for psychedelics when there isn't a single FDA-approved psychedelic treatment other than ketamine, which is technically shouldn't really be considered a psychedelic. It seems insane to me that this became the dominant part of our conversation. This like, oh my God, someone pivoted from a nonprofit to a for-profit. Who cares?
Yeah.
Actually, who cares? How lucky are we that anyone is even developing these things as medicines? Why take that for granted? It's incredibly short-sighted. And the people who are promoting this are not people who understand the sacrifices and the difficulty of getting to this place that we're currently at.
I think some of them are.
Some of them are.
Yeah.
Some of
them
them
talk about some of this very strong specific criticisms leveled by certain people and journals where, it's puzzling to me, the vehemence with which some people are attacking MAPS and attack Compass. Given that, I agree with you on the big picture. How remarkable is it that this is being contemplated as an FDA-approved therapy?
And what a Herculean task.
Yeah.
And there's something that really disturbs me about how dismissive people have been of MAPS efforts. It's amazing how quickly it goes to, they fucked it up. They dropped the ball.
Yeah.
This is the big leagues. This is the FDA.
Yeah.
You got to do real science. Sorry, Rick.
Yeah.
Like I see things like that on Reddit, and then it gets a bunch of upvotes where people are like, I mean, needless to say, this is real science. What do you expect? You got to hold yourself to a higher standard. But yet nobody is even mentioning what the problems were. And when you actually dissect these problems, these supposed problems, I think many of them are either illusory or exist for a reason that has been interrogated carefully in terms of a cost-benefit analysis. The main example being the lack of a active placebo group. So people say, oh, why didn't they use low-dose MDMA? This caused functional unblinding. They tried. They used low-dose MDMA and it was anxiogenic. So
for people, right. So this was the criticism being, one of the main criticisms is that basically the study was effectively unblinded because people who took it, I think the stats were people who got MDMA. So it was always assisted therapy. So people were getting a lot of therapy in either condition. But the people who got MDMA, I think 90%, interestingly, it wasn't 100%, but I think it was like 90% knew they got MDMA. People who didn't get MDMA was like 75% knew they didn't get MDMA. So the vast majority of participants and probably therapists knew what people were getting. And so it pierces the placebo.
Yeah.
And the FDA had apparently suggested to MAPS, hey, you can use low-dose MDMA as a placebo, and MAPS in like some sort of striated trial earlier where they tried different striated with different dose levels had found that low-dose MDMA was actually anxiogenic. It made people anxious. So it created worse experiences for people. So they were resistant to that. In the service of not harming patients.
And crucially, this isn't phase 1. So for people that aren't aware, in a phase 1 clinical trial, you have healthy people. Mm-hmm. But as soon as you progress to phase 2, you are treating people with a disorder. And so you have a medical responsibility not to harm them for the sake of maximizing the scientific value of a clinical intervention.
Getting them like the most pristine, unimpeachable data. It's not a justification for potentially causing these people suffering.
So the same thing goes further. They say, well, why didn't they control for the therapy and give MDMA to people who are left alone in a room
without the
therapeutic? And it's because that's potentially dangerous, or at the very least could potentially be painful. I mean, which is dangerous for people that have a very serious disorder
and high risk of suicide.
And I think it wasn't a lack of scientific integrity. It was a abundance of compassion and an understanding of the significance of what they were doing that made them not do things like that, even if it would have in some way produced clinical data that was unimpeachable. I mean, the other thing is that they did control for they did therapy alone and it had a therapeutic effect. It was positive.
A big one, which is ironically has been a criticism. I think a criticism somewhat of the FDA, where maybe or the advisory committee, where it was like, well, the placebo effect was so first of all, the effect sizes were massive. I think it's like 75% or 65% in the control group no longer qualified for a PTSD diagnosis. So I would translate it into lay terms, they didn't have the disorder anymore. I mean,
in the control group?
In the experimental group, in the treatment group. Yeah. But in the control group, it was fucking massive too. I want to say 40% or something in the control group.
Yes, I think another
who were effectively seemed to be cured without MDMA, but with extensive therapy. 2 therapists in the room, more intensive therapy than you would typically get in an outpatient program without MDMA, much more intensive.
Yeah.
And obviously also a different type of therapy where you're in a room with people for 6 or 8 hours, which is a different experience than doing 6 or 8 1-hour sessions where you're going into an office, in a room that's been set up a certain way. So this was a very, very targeted, developed protocol designed to maximize the results as anyone would in any trial. And the placebo people got all of this protocol save MDMA.
Yeah. So I think that they absolutely made the right decision in not just giving it to people who are left alone in a room without therapy. And so I was really shocked to see these criticisms that seem so easy to recognize as misguided being discussed as if they were true flaws with the trial design.
And sorry, to clarify, so these are criticisms that specifically the FDA advisory committee mentioned, and then people kind of piled on social media saying like, well, yeah, obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah, but the FDA advisory committee kind of enumerated these as concerns.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of these concerns were kind of ridiculous. All this stuff about blood pressure and hepatotoxicity, as if this is a drug that millions of people haven't used safely under the most unsafe imaginable conditions, where deaths are extraordinarily rare.
Yeah.
I mean, this is people that will be using it just a small number of times under extremely controlled conditions. It seems pretty clear to me that the risk of any kind of organ toxicity is negligible, or cardiotoxicity.
But so just to unpack this a little bit, and this was someone who was involved in not phase 3, but earlier phase trials of MAPS, told me that, yeah, he feels MAPS dropped the ball here, and specifically MAPS feeling. And Rick had, I remember him even saying this to me at some after party, this beautiful irony that in the war on drugs, and I think it was the National Institute of Drug Abuse maybe, but certain organizations were looking for harm specifically, because these were dangerous drugs of abuse.
Yeah.
The harms of MDMA and LSD have been so much more thoroughly studied than any SSRI, any psychotrope, FDA-approved psychotropic medication. We have this tremendous trove of data on safety. People were looking for lack of safety, and ironically, what they found is, no, this stuff is pretty damn safe.
Yeah.
And so Rick's feeling was, great, we don't have to do as extensive basic safety research because, ironically, these anti-drug organizations kind of did our homework for us there. It's been, as you said, extensively studied in use cases where you'd think they would be far more harmful. People ingesting chemicals where it's probably adulterated with other stuff and stimulants, doing it when they're not drinking enough water and dancing all night, doing it in these conditions that would maximize harms. And yet we see, as you said, very, very rarely are there, severe adverse events like very severe health conditions or deaths.
Yeah.
And so MAPS felt like, hey, great, we don't have to do that much work. But what this person said, who again was involved in earlier phase trials, was, yeah, but what MAPS didn't really get is the FDA, they have a certain way of doing things, a certain protocol. And MAPS specifically, this person's criticism was, MAPS is not getting approval for MDMA. They're not getting approval for ecstasy. They're getting approval for their specific formulation of MDMA combined with psychotherapy. And even though, yes, there's no reason to expect there'd be more harms with this, you still need to jump through these bureaucratic hoops and do this stuff on liver toxicity and cardiotoxicity. And that was a grave oversight on MAP's part.
I don't know that it was. I definitely don't think it was a true oversight. I'm under the impression that they have been in continuous conversation with FDA regulators. This is not the first time the FDA has become aware of the research.
The FDA helped, I think, even design some of the initial trials. They were very, very involved.
Absolutely. So That's a great point. Yeah.
Matt
Baggett told me that it had been agreed that there was sufficient preclinical toxicology data to...
Right. What you're saying feels obvious to me. Right. Of course. This is, why would this suddenly be an issue now?
Yeah. No, there's too many people working on this, and they've been working on it for too long to make true oversights like that.
Right. That doesn't really seem plausible when you consider that the FDA has been intimately involved in literally designing this research, at least in the early phases, I believe, and has been in constant communication. And
they have to be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. This is getting more interesting.
Yes. Yeah. So that isn't a good
That's
argument.
like some red herring. This is just some...
Most of it is. And then, the abuse concern is also something that I think just we're in this cultural moment where people are so afraid to look insensitive.
The idea that this therapy or that MDMA has potential for abuse.
Yeah.
And that this is a risk of approving this therapy.
That it will promote transgressions on therapists. I don't think that's validated in no one has done a statistical analysis.
Yeah.
And of course the work that has been done on the prevalence of therapist sexual abuse is hard to interpret because it's like survey data where they ask therapists if they've ever had a sexual relationship with a patient, which you can imagine would would skew in terms of minimization. Yes, yeah. But even there's a pretty significant number that acknowledge having done it, and then you can also survey patients, and it's more than would be expected. Like, if we were to compare, again, you can't really make a direct comparison or do some kind of statistical analysis. I looked into that, but if you were to say that one patient had this kind of sexual relationship with a therapist out of over 300.
To give context, because so far as I know, there was one extensively documented case, I think it was in Canada, of one of the a therapist in these trials who had a sexual relationship with one of the participants.
Yeah.
And you're saying that, like, based on what you've been able to find, this seems like you'd kind of expect this based on the baseline level of therapists getting into sexual relationships with their patients.
Yeah, tentatively. And I was talking with a psychiatrist about this, and he countered that point by saying that he wasn't aware of any other recorded instances of therapist sexual transgressions during clinical evaluation of a therapy. And then you could also say, well, that's the whole issue, is that there's something different because of the psychoactivity. It makes people more vulnerable to abuse. And I think that there's maybe something to be said for that. But even with that point, the fact remains that there wasn't an epidemic of sexual abuse. And on top of that, a few complicating factors in all of this. One is that the sexual relationship between the patient and the therapist wasn't during the MDMA therapy session. It was after they lived on a private island, and she moved onto the island with the two therapists and lived with them for a year. Then after that year, reported the therapist to MAPS. MAPS then conducted an investigation, fired the therapist, issued a public apology, gave her money for therapy, and then she contacted Symposia and told them that there was video footage of her being held inappropriately during one of the sessions. To the best of my knowledge, she had not actually told MAPS about this, which is the reason that they hadn't seen it. And people say, oh, how could they not review the footage? Well, they were never required to even produce this footage in the first place. The fact that they were recording all these sessions is a testament to how seriously they took the task of ensuring patient safety. And this hasn't been publicly said, but supposedly the story that I've heard is that when Megan Buisson requested the footage, lawyers advised Rick not to give her the footage because they said that they weren't legally required to do it, or that she should have to sign an NDA. And he, knowing that it would open him up to all sorts of problems, did the right thing and said, you don't have to sign an NDA. Here's access to all of your footage. And so a lot of what happened with this is a sort of punishment for effectively doing the right thing.
For being an awesome dude.
Yeah.
Which is, So, wow, I did not know that.
Yeah. So if the idea is, MAPS are a bunch of clowns, it's like, you think that Big Pharma would be better about this? Just have an NDA and the team of lawyers intimidating anybody that experienced anything. And instead, he did everything in his power to help and accommodate the desires of this person who he felt was harmed and she felt was harmed. So there's that. And it's unrealistic to review all of that footage if the patient hasn't reported a problem or if the therapists haven't reported a problem. So it wasn't until she made Symposia aware that footage was even reviewed. So again, I think that a lot of these criticisms are a lot more complicated than most people realize. And, one of the ideas that keeps getting brought up is that people are afraid to come forward if something bad has happened because they could destroy the entire movement, that there's this sense that it's hard for people who have been wronged to speak out because of the political and legal and cultural dimensions associated with the psychedelic movement. But I actually don't think that this helps anyone, because what this is the worst case scenario. This is saying somebody acknowledged harms, let's derail everything because somebody acknowledged harms. If I were in the position of having had something inappropriate happen to me, I would be 10 times more afraid to mention it if I cared at all about the progress of this therapy, because this is kind of making it really clear. If you go public about something, other people will predatorily exploit your suffering in order to help their careers or whatever. And even I have seen things, not clinically, but I've seen things academically that were disturbing to me. And I, if anything, feel that same thought of like, that would be a mess. This wouldn't be about constructive mitigation of harms. This would be used to tar the entire movement as intrinsically dangerous. And I really think that that's a dangerous road to go down that will, if anything, promote silence.
Yeah. But that is the road that's being gone down now. This zero tolerance, and not just with the sexual abuse, but with everything. It feels like, because as you said, it was an overwhelming recommendation against approval. And
the same thing with this guy, the pilot who started pulling switches on the airplane, where I noticed that a lot of people, what's his name?
The pilot, or?
No, I'm trying to remember, the former Johns Hopkins guy.
Matthew Johnson?
Matthew Johnson.
Yeah.
Right? So then there was this kind of, Matthew Johnson was saying this, Jules Evans, whose whole thing is this, they were, saying like, we need to have a conversation about the reality that derealization is a effect that many people experience after.
Sorry, Matthew Johnson said this. We need to have a conversation. About like derealization. Happen. Okay.
And and then there was like this kind of conflict, at least on social media, of do we minimize that this occurred, or do we double down and say we need to, 4.7% of people who have been given psilocybin experience derealization in the days after the experience, and we need to start talking about this.
Yeah.
And my feeling about this is, one, that I have been exposed to so much information about the dangers of drugs that the idea that anyone isn't already aware of that is absurd to me. Mm-hmm. That like, we need to talk about how drugs can sometimes be dangerous. Maybe this is a generational thing or something, but it seems almost like a joke to me.
I actually disagree with you here.
Yeah.
I just feel like there's so much exuberance around psychedelics, and I'm sure you see it too, as these people, as you said, these kind of newcomers who have maybe just read a little bit about a few hours or have heard anecdotal reports on microdosing. And I certainly see it with people hitting me up on social media now for help with OCD, where I think a lot of these people are very naive to the potential harms. I mean, the first thing I tell people is I had one trip that made my OCD much worse for a period of months.
Right.
Like this is, so I do think, I see the danger of like trumpeting every danger, and I very much want this stuff to be approved. But I do think that when you and I mean, we met 2007, and I remember the first conference at least I went to, where you were at, was Horizons, in Judson Church, where there were 150 people there, and everyone was pretty much a drug nerd or a researcher. Those people, I think, were very cognizant of, like, it wasn't even something worth saying. Of course, there's potential harms. Of course, there's going to be drawbacks. But I just think that, there's such a current of exuberance that I think there are a lot of people out there who really don't appreciate the fact of how powerful and how harmful this stuff can be.
Yes, I'm sure there are some of those people. But even when somebody talks to me about microdosing, it's often from this perspective of, gee whiz, I thought these were dangerous drugs, but turns out that if you microdose them, you can actually have this or that kind of mild effect. Or gee whiz, I thought these were dangerous drugs, but it turns out they're actually medicines as well. Wow, I had no idea. That's the typical. I don't know that I've ever met anyone who is truly unaware. I'm sure that such people do exist.
Yeah.
And I guess I don't even really know what the state of media is. I don't even know how many people watch TV anymore.
Yeah.
Like, anti-drug messaging was such a big part of my upbringing in the 90s that to me, it seems impossible that somebody wouldn't have been immersed in that culturally. But I guess I actually don't know the typical degree of anti-drug messaging that a Gen Z person, for example, has been exposed to.
I assume they have been exposed, though I actually don't know, and that's an interesting question. But so I guess what I'm saying is I don't think there are people walking around who have never been exposed to the idea of drugs being bad. But I feel like there are people who have kind of been like, oh yeah, that was propaganda. The truth is this stuff is just good,
right,
helpful.
Right.
And maybe I'm oversimplifying. Maybe they don't, maybe there is still some niggling like in the back of their mind, like, oh yeah, these are illegal drugs and there can be something dangerous. And that just isn't getting played up because I just see firsthand a lot of people who feel like, and especially the population I'm most interacting with around this is often people with OCD who are very risk averse. And certainly a lot of those people, they are very risk averse in their communications with me. But some of these people, it feels like they're looking at this as a panacea and not fully appreciating the fact of how dicey this shit can be.
Well, I also think there's a little bit of a pharmaco-reductionist dimension to it that I'm uncomfortable with, which is talking about these things as if these are intrinsic qualities of the drug. And people do this with both positive and negative aspects of these drugs. So I don't want to have a double standard because I think this very much also applies to the positive effects. But people will, if you say 14% of cannabis users experience overwhelming anxiety, I don't know that that's THC. It's the interplay of THC with that person's psychology and nervous system. And probably that same person generally has an increased propensity for anxiety. Maybe not in all cases, but I think that this is a manifestation of that person's psychology. So if the idea is, 4.5% of people experience derealization in the days after a psychedelic experience, I suspect that this is not randomly distributed, like you're spinning a roulette wheel and just any person.
It happened to anyone,
It just hasn't happened to me
unlucky,
yet. But next time I use a psychedelic, I might lose track of reality for a few days. I imagine that these people probably have a innate propensity for derealization episodes. And this is also, of course, the case with schizophrenia. And the best evidence for that is that there isn't increased schizophrenia among psychedelic drug users. It doesn't differ from the general population. And so do some people have psychotic breaks after using psychedelics? Absolutely. I've seen it with my own eyes. But that doesn't mean that that person wouldn't have otherwise had a psychotic break, and that it may be promoting an existing tendency. And then you could say, well, it doesn't matter because it's still in the population and certain numbers of people will use those drugs. And if more people are using the drugs, then that 4.5% will be more people or whatever. I mean, it's all complicated. And I'm not criticizing Matthew Johnson for talking about this. That's not the point. I actually think it is very important to acknowledge harms. I just have this kind of prickly feeling when people get so immersed in the harms that they forget how big a part of the discourse that has been for so long, that I think that there really is a justification for emphasizing benefits simply because they haven't even been discussed or acknowledged by the majority of people.
And to put this into the bigger context, what I think you're saying is one of your concerns about this emphasis on harms is that we're kind of exposing our flank to people who are looking for reasons to shoot this down. Giving ammo to people who don't want these drugs to be approved.
The other really complicated aspect of this is that cultural perceptions of drugs change the nature of the drug experience itself. And so this is actually one of my concerns. I don't know that I've even heard anyone say this, but if every single article that gets published is demonizing corporatization and commercialization of psychedelics and talking about it as a money grab by evil billionaire capitalists who don't care about you. Well, what is someone who's read that article going to experience if they consume a psychedelic as a treatment for depression? Is there a chance that that messaging in and of itself could...
Right, if it's like, oh, I'm part of this extractive industry that's capitalizing on exploiting indigenous wisdom so that the CEO can buy a second Gulfstream versus, this is this organization that's run by these people who are really passionate about helping people with PTSD. I could very much see that not only shaping the experience, but shaping the whole, how you put that into context of after the fact, which is, of course, is a big part of this stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I haven't heard anyone articulate that. That never occurred to me, but...
Yeah, because you think about getting a Prozac prescription or something like that, and all the baggage associated with the name Prozac and the concept of Prozac that exists is a completely extra pharmacological dimension of the experience.
And backing this up is, about the, what is it called? I think it might be the decline effect. This has been found widely in science, including even measurements of basic physical properties like gravity, but it's most prominent in social sciences and psychiatric medications, where the data seems like this stuff becomes less effective over time, not on an individual level, but on a collective level, meaning the effect sizes for Prozac in the 80s were much greater than what we're seeing for Prozac in the 2020s.
Yeah. I could totally, So that's another concern. Of course, I would never say this if I felt that the concerns were really important, right? Like I would never say that people should deny a fundamental problem or something that is truly dangerous. The real reason that I'm saying this, of course, is because I think these concerns are illusory and overblown to the point of ridiculousness. And that is the big thing, is like you're concerned about these relatively minuscule pharmaceutical companies doing this as a profit grab. Definitely not. Like all these people have, if they just cared about money, they would have much better ways to make money. Nobody is getting into psychedelic research thinking that they're going to become ultra rich. I just don't. Maybe at the absolute top, some people are thinking they'll make a little bit of money, but every single person I've talked to, including some of the most despised people in the psychedelic sphere, like Christian Angemeyer, they're not talking about it that way privately. They're truly interested in creating things because they think it will be beneficial.
So, all right. So this is great. So we have a mystery here, at least a mystery to me, because you have debunked what I had bought into this argument that, MAPS, they just kind of dropped the ball on some things that really shouldn't be that important, but you kind of have to play by these FDA rules and do this basic fundamental safety data on cardiotoxicity and liver toxicity and all this stuff. But what you're saying is that, well, no, the FDA was in communication with MAPS continuously. So it sounds like you're saying that there's something going on beneath the surface here.
Oh, absolutely. I've looked far and wide, and I have not seen any criticisms that strike me as indications of genuine flaws in the trial design or indications that the work that MAPS is doing is dangerous or that the harms outweigh the benefits.
Which is literally what the FDA advisory committee said, is that the harms or the potential harms outweigh the potential benefit, and that there were flaws in these, in the not collecting this basic safety data.
And then to even go further, you can make an argument against what I'm about to say, but even if they're right and it gets approved, there's post-marketing surveillance. I mean, there's pharmacovigilance.
Right.
Like, if a drug is harming people, it's taken off the market. It's not like that's it forever.
Right.
A drug can be removed from the market and is removed from the market for legal reasons, if not compassionate medical ones, because it opens up the manufacturer to all sorts of liability. There will inevitably be class action lawsuits. So you look at a drug like lorcaserin, this diet drug, there was very minor evidence that it was carcinogenic. I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was very low, and they just pulled it.
Yeah.
And this is, who knows how many millions invested into lorcaserin. Same thing with Ramonabond. They just pulled it.
Yeah.
And that's the tendency. It's not worth the risk to run a pharmaceutical enterprise and harm patients. It's far too dangerous. Forget from a legal financial liability standpoint, it's a disaster. Forget the ethical aspects.
It's just bad
of this.
business.
Yeah.
It's bad business. So if all these supposed justifications for this advisory committee recommendation against approval, that I've heard different opinions as to does that doom this? But whatever it is, it clearly is a major setback. So if all of those justifications are bullshit, what's really going on?
Well,
and I think we're now at the core of your obsession about this.
Yes, yeah. So I've personally seen how various interest groups have modified the way that people conceptualize these issues. And I was starting to get at this with the Olivia Goldhill, Catherine McLean article.
Yeah.
Which is in some sense the worst example of this, because nothing said in that article is untrue. I think that it promotes a sort of one-sided scaremongering version of events, but she isn't lying. She's not making anything up.
Yeah.
It's I think sort of, and I don't know that she ever acknowledged that she was friends with Catherine McLean, which is, I think, one of the lesser known journalistic sins, and is typically not acknowledged as a conflict of interest, right? If you work for someone, that's obviously a conflict of interest. But if I'm reporting a review of your show, I've got a pretty fucking big conflict of interest. I'm not going to write an article saying bad things about your show.
Yeah.
If I wrote an article about your show, it would be exclusively positive because you're my friend.
Can I put that on my flyers? If I wrote a review of your show, it'd be exclusively positive. Allison Morris.
But this is surprisingly prevalent, and people outside of media spheres don't realize how prevalent this particular bias is, and it really does change the nature of reporting in a big way. So whatever, Catherine McLean's criticisms of Compass are her own. She didn't like that they pivoted to being a for-profit entity. They knew that it was a necessary thing in order to get the therapy to market. There was a disagreement. That's valid and was more or less articulated as such, although, of course, the bias was toward Catherine McLean's grievances. So that was how things sort of began. That got the ball rolling. And what I believe occurred subsequently was that other players in the game became aware that the reputational dimensions of this were very delicate and could be exploited in interesting ways to further various interests. So then the next tier of this was, at the exact same time that I left Vice, they hired a, I think, freelance blogger named Shayla Love, and she wrote an article describing going to a mushroom clinic in Amsterdam and feeling like it wasn't adequately supervised and having a unpleasant experience. No one really noticed or cared about this article, but then she started talking to Carrie Turnbull and reporting a lot of things that were, I think, intensely biased because they were coming from a business competitor of Compass against Compass. So Carrie Turnbull realizes that he can use Shayla Love.
And Carrie Turnbull, what is his affiliation?
He's the co-founder of USONA.
Right.
And also has a for-profit company that's simultaneously developing psilocybin called Ceruvia, and another company called Be More, and then there's another company called Freedom to Operate, and then another company called Porta Sophia, that are all interconnected in this complicated web of for-profit and non-profit companies in a way that is very confusing for people that aren't deeply invested in understanding this. And that's also a kind of armor.
And Porta Sophia is like the patent database, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's, which was one of the big criticisms leveled against Compass, was trying to patent psilocybin
completely self-servingly. But
Porta Sophia, is that for-profit? I thought that was a non-profit.
It's non-profit.
But it's linked to these other...
It's co-founded by Bill Linton, who's the co-founder of USONA.
And USONA is a non-profit though, right?
For now.
And USONA is they've been a non-profit for a long time.
Yeah. As was Maps.
Right, as was Maps.
As was Compass. So that part of it is that I think this idea of elevating nonprofits to some kind of status of moral superiority is misguided because, first of all, who cares? But secondly, they can change to a for-profit entity anytime they want. So what's the point of that game?
Right.
The other is that if the same people who are running the nonprofits are involved with for-profit enterprises, who cares even more? Because they can just launder their interests through various groups. And I think that what they're doing is actually far more dishonest and destructive than anything Compass did. And I had this sense that Shayla Love's reporting was extremely biased.
And sorry, what's the link between Shayla Love and Carrie Turnbull?
The link is simply that she was a young, ambitious journalist. And when you're a journalist, you're looking for sources. You're looking for people that will talk to you.
Yeah.
And there's always a bit of a quid pro quo element to these dynamics, right? If you're talking to a journalist, it's typically because you believe that that journalist is going to promote your perspective or your interests in some way. And Carrie Turnbull started giving Shayla Love lots and lots of stories. She could then sell those stories. So I'm not suggesting that she was like being paid off by Carrie Turnbull. I'm suggesting that it was advantageous for her because she got lots of stories that she could sell to Vice. It was very much advantageous to Carrie Turnbull because he had somebody that was exclusively reporting from his perspective. And then you get this kind of echo chamber where Shayla Love writes something, then Porta Sophia promotes what she writes, then David Bronner, who's a major investor in USONA, or donor to USONA, promotes it. And someone who's just looking at this superficially might not realize is that this entire thing is being orchestrated by people who have interests. It's not organically emerging. Right. It looks like people are saying, oh, we got to sound the alarm on Compass. And it's like, well, maybe acknowledge that you have invested huge amounts of money in a company that hypothetically could experience interference, although none has actually been observed, but it's a hypothetical possibility. They're pursuing different indications. So that right off the bat is already, I think, reason enough to think that these are non-issues. On top of that,
different indications between USONA
and
which is so they're both studying psilocybin.
But USONA is pursuing MDD, major depressive disorder, whereas Compass is pursuing treatment-resistant depression.
Okay. All right, I didn't know that.
And I wouldn't be surprised if there are all kinds of anxieties associated with developing. I mean, no one wants to be compassionate to billionaires, but even billionaires, probably maybe especially billionaires, have financial concerns. And I could imagine them having a lot of anxiety about all this. One thing would be that this therapy will be expensive, and insurers will be most likely to recommend a inexpensive therapy as a first line for treatment of MDD. Yeah. So you go through Prozac and Paxil and Wellbutrin and whatever else. By the time that an insurer may feel comfortable approving psilocybin, you may already qualify for treatment-resistant depression, putting them in a very awkward position. This is another thing I've never heard anyone say. I could be wrong about this. Yeah. This is my if I were them, this would be something that might frighten me a little bit.
Yeah.
So they're working with journalists. The journalists are producing these stories, some of which are more in the Olivia Goldhill direction of factually correct, but I feel biased in some way. But then something changed when Shayla published this article suggesting the Compass had interfered with legalization efforts in Oregon, which they hadn't, objectively.
Yeah.
And that was the first time where I thought, ooh, I am very uncomfortable with this, because it was blowing back on me. Like, there's video recordings of me on stage with a legalized nature guy saying, how can you work with this company? They're interfering with legalization, right? But they weren't.
So I certainly heard these allegations. I don't know anything about the substance of them or...
Well, this is another disturbing journalistic trend that I've noticed, where you can say something or indicate something and provide no evidence of it.
Yeah.
But if it feeds into a pre-existing bias, people will run with it. So the only evidence that was provided was that George Goldsmith had written a friendly email.
Really?
That was the only evidence.
And what was the substance of the email? You said friendly. It was
like, hey, I see that you're pushing for these legalization efforts. I'm the founder of a company that is pursuing a medical route to the approval of psilocybin. Although our roots and beliefs surrounding this therapy may differ, I would love to have a conversation with you. Something like that.
And that was the only evidence.
And then my friend, a journalist, John Semley, reached out to the organizer of 109 and said, can you substantiate these claims that there was interference? And they explicitly, I have the email, he sent it to me, said no.
So the article, it had no substantive...
No, it's just this kind of...
alleging that this had happened.
Yeah, it's just, well, it's even softer than that. It's kind of like, you kind of say, concerns...
I've been raised that Compass may
be doing unethical things
somehow.
And with efforts to legalize on the horizon, concerns circulate about the influence of...
People say.
Yeah. and so you're not really saying anything, but you're creating this sense that something bad has happened when there is no evidence whatsoever of that. So that disturbed me. And I saw directly firsthand, in terms of being attacked, the negative ramifications of that type of reporting. And, you can also, of course, make the argument that this is just an unbelievably stupid distraction from the real issue, which is decriminalization, legalization, drug policy reform. Instead, we're arguing about illusory interference from pharmaceutical companies and not fighting for our freedom. So that is, I think, just very bad. That was the first that I saw. And so I started to see more instances of this. Another one that I've mentioned to you is that I was speaking at the Horizons conference and was attacked is too strong of a word, but I was called out with a prepared statement from an audience member who is suggesting that I had done something unethical by not giving back to the indigenous people of the world, despite the fact that the work that I do has resulted in no profit to give back to anyone, only costs, expenses. There's nothing to give back, and none of it is derived from indigenous knowledge. But then the real twist on this was that person was an employee of USONA, which is a company developing psilocybin, which is not giving back to the indigenous people of the world. And when I realized that it actually was like painful for me, because I realized that my most paranoid suspicions had been validated, and that there was something, that moralism was being weaponized in a way that was truly against people's interests, that nothing good would come. I mean, it's also, I think, I can counter that moralism with some more moralism and say that it's an insult to indigenous people to use them as tools for this sort of argument. Like, this is white people exploiting the concept of indigeneity in order to wage their petty reputational battles.
And in this case, not just reputational, but probably commercial. Yeah. Exploiting indigenous people by accusing someone else of exploiting indigenous people for profit.
Yeah. It's disturbing. And of course, coming from hypersensitive people in the humanities who, if I had to bet, aren't even fully aware of what they're doing. Like, if I bet that woman hadn't even fully recognized. In fact, I'm pretty confident that she lacked sufficient self-awareness to realize how stupid what she was doing was.
The assumption, though, is that she knew that she was attacking a commercial competitor of USONA.
She knew that.
Yeah.
But I think that she was so lacking in the necessary self-awareness that she probably didn't actually know. That's what,
like, at some level, felt like she was doing the right thing.
Like she drank the Kool-Aid.
Yeah.
And really thought that she was sticking it to the man
Right. And you can imagine justifications like, well, yes, we're a competitor, but no, we're not, because USONA is a nonprofit and Compass is an evil for-profit corporation. And, we're the ones who are standing up for, maybe we haven't given back to the indigenous people yet, but that's because we're a nonprofit. We're, we don't have a lot of money like this wealthy for-profit company that actually is not making money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of instances of this that I collected over time and started to see more and more of this use of moralism to launder various interests. And it got bad enough that I was scheduled to give this talk at a conference in Miami, and I decided that I would last minute change the talk and discuss my concerns. And I brought up the fact that Compass had been unfairly and falsely accused of interfering with legalization efforts in Oregon, that I felt that many of the criticisms at that time were totally overblown and were coming from people with undisclosed conflicts of interest. And I was just eviscerated on social media for having done this. And the conclusion of that talk was my fear that this would all have downstream effects on MAPS, and that by getting so wrapped up in these moral crusades against one another, that the movement could be fundamentally harmed for very much the wrong reasons. Obviously, if the movement deserves to be harmed, harm it all the live long day. But these were not real reasons to harm it. And the intensity of the negative response was astonishing to me. I mean, someone wrote an entire article attacking me, saying that I was not really doing chemistry for Compass, that I was a clandestine PR agent, all this stuff, no evidence provided. But I guess you don't need to provide evidence. Yeah. You can just say it and it kind of sounds true. So why not just run with it? And that...
Yeah, I mean, obviously the broader context of this is outrage journalism. This is what gets clicks. This is what gets, doing an article about, I went to this this mushroom therapy session and had a great experience, probably would have gotten a lot of traction in 2016. But now that's not going to get the sort of traction of, I had this negative experience. There's something untoward happening, something unethical happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Without question.
Yeah.
And the other effect of this that was disturbing to me was this implicit communication that if you speak out against this, you will be destroyed.
Yeah.
That there are going to be major repercussions for articulating any of these concerns. And when I look back at that talk, everything that I said was a very good prediction of events that later transpired. So now you're seeing it with MAPS, and you have all kinds of interests. And I see it on social media. I see people saying things that I know they're receiving money from this or that person. Like, I know for a fact.
Can you name names?
I could name names. I don't want to name names because I don't want to start shit. But yes, I know from direct personal admission in some of these instances that somebody's saying something and that they're receiving money from somebody that would promote that perspective.
Wow.
Without acknowledging it. And then, if I were to name names, this one I don't know with certainty, but Jules Evans, who's kind of like the primary cautionary psychedelic proponent, is supposedly receiving money from the Sarlo family. That's been alleged.
And what is the Sarlo family's link to all of this?
This is not something that I've obsessed over.
Yeah.
But in my cursory examination of the issue, it was at worst a sort of Anna Nicole Smith type scenario where you had a kind of rich, maybe lonely older man who was befriended by somebody at MAPS. They did MDMA, and he became a fervent supporter of their cause and donated lots of money. His children or heirs then accused MAPS of elder abuse and having exploited him, similar to the Anna Nicole Smith kind of situation. I don't think that there's particularly strong evidence for that. I haven't seen it, if it is the case. And so the claim is that the Sarlo family is in part funding some of this opposition. That's one claim. That's not a big one, but that's just an example. And that's also one that I haven't personally confirmed. So I say that with but I've heard it from someone who's not the type to mindlessly gossip about such things.
So then, if you're willing to talk about that, why don't you want to talk about the ones where you have more concrete evidence? I mean, I understand the general thing of not wanting to start shit.
Well, also, I don't want to oversimplify things, because I think that when people think about conflicts of interest, they think about someone who's behaving in a purely cynical way. And I think that's very rarely the case.
Yeah,
I think what actually happens is that most people believe that what they're doing is right.
Yep.
And so what really happens, it's not like, ha ha ha, the Sarlo family gave me a briefcase of money, now I can destroy maps in exchange for some cash. It's like, I really appreciate that you're bringing light to these issues in a way that nobody else is. If I can help fund your research, it would be greatly appreciated. That's kind of the way that these things tend to actually play out. And for that reason, this is, again, comes back to me. This is one reason that I've been hesitant to say most of these things, because I feel like there's a valid objection to me saying them.
Right.
Like, I have my own...
As long as you have a stake in this.
Which I don't.
Right.
But anymore.
Right.
But, the other thing is that, the main group that's promoting these criticisms at one time were conceptualized as whistleblowers, watchdogs, people that were trying to prevent harms, and things progressed to, I think, a really important inflection point, which is when people start to lie. As soon as people start to lie, that's where, because if it's a matter of differing perspectives on a thing that really happened, like if Catherine McLean's perspective is that she was exploited because she worked for a company thinking that it was a nonprofit and they became a for-profit, that's a perspective on an event that occurred.
Yeah.
But if somebody is lying about something that didn't occur, that's very dangerous. And that is where things have started. And the prime example would be Nishay Devanagh speaking to the FDA during the commentary period and saying that MAPS therapist Veronica Gold pinned down a patient while they screamed, "Get your fucking hands off of me," but she wouldn't stop.
So I know Veronica Gold, and I haven't heard this.
So I don't know Veronica Gold. I'd never heard her name before.
Yeah.
I was just watching this, and I thought, oh my God, she pinned down a patient while the patient screamed, "Get your fucking hands off of me."
And wait, and how did
she wouldn't stop?
Yeah. Sorry, go on. Hey, tell me more about it.
Yeah. And then Nishay has a citation for this claim. So I think, how on earth is this the first time I'm hearing about a MAPS therapist during this clinical trial pinning down a patient on MDMA while they screamed, "Get your fucking hands off of me"? This is unbelievable. I look at the citation for this. It's a book called Integral Psychedelic Therapy. And the section that is being quoted in this book is not MDMA psychotherapy, nor is it a MAPS trial. And it is being radically taken out of context. So this is Veronica Gold conducting non-MAPS affiliated ketamine psychotherapy with a patient who had been abused as a child. And the section that's being quoted from is about cathartic physical release of emotional trauma. And so this person who'd been abused is speaking to the memory of their father, saying, "Get your fucking hands off of me," not to Veronica Gold. I mean, this is Veronica Gold writing this.
I was going to say, how would it make it into it? Right.
Yeah, this is not like some kind of observation of a therapy session. This is her own description of
how to do this sort of work.
And, and there's nothing about the patient being pinned down. That part is completely fabricated. Or Veronica Gold not stopping while the patient said, "Get your fucking hands off of me." That's also fabricated.
And did no one call this out?
No one said anything. And this again speaks to that fear that was promoted during the Wonderland fallout of, holy shit, this is really bad. This is, I mean, it's a federal crime. This is not just unethical. This is a criminal act. I mean, this is not a small thing.
And there's been no blowback. No one's.
Not only has there been no blowback.
Have you talked about this before?
A little bit on my podcast. Yeah. But with great.
Sorry, not a big fan.
Haven't
listened.
With great hesitation and.
We're competitors now.
Go on. And
What the fuck? I mean, I know Nishay, not well, but I've met her I've met her a few times. I'm floored.
And she's reading from a script. This is a written statement. So it's not a situation. It wasn't
like a spontaneous thing where she slipped up.
Oops.
Yeah.
No, this was prepared in advance, knowingly. A knowing misrepresentation. And I refuse for a moment to believe otherwise. She knew exactly what she was doing, and no one noticed. No one said anything. And this is the sort of stuff, it was actually repeated credulously in media reports. There's a Vox article. It's, we need to start talking about the dangers of MDMA, psychotherapy, whatever. The real unknown is the psychotherapy. And they just describe this saying, Veronica Gold pinned down a patient. So that's one example. I mean, obviously, then there's a whole ridiculous idea that they are a therapy cult analogous.
And we can say,
Nexium.
so I think Nishay and the whole therapy cult thing that has been promulgated by Symposia.
Yeah.
People writing for Symposia, David Nichols, and just being very, very aggressive against MAPS. It has been for quite a while.
Yes, extremely.
Yeah.
Fanatically.
Yeah, I would say so. And my conflict of interest here, so Symposia was founded by Mike Margulies and Brian Norman, both of whom I consider friends. So Mike Margulies left Symposia years ago. Brian is still there, and I haven't talked to Brian in a couple of years, but someone I like personally and have been very surprised. Initially, I'd say surprised was the right verb for like their sort of turn. It seemed like, but I'm like, there's a value in having kind of a muckraking journalistic organization in this space. But as it's gotten increasingly, I guess I would agree with fanatical and just
vindictive,
hysterical. Like even using this phrase, therapy cult. I mean, first of all, what does that mean? MAPS is not a cult by any accepted definition of a cult. And it seemed kind of unhinged, and I've been puzzled as to what's behind it.
Yeah. And when you become that vindictive, you also can't do journalism anymore. This is why journalists are supposed to be impartial and not ideologues, because, if they reach out to me for a quote, I'm not going to talk to them.
Yeah.
I know that they will just take something that I say out of context to make me look bad.
Yeah.
And so you can't do journalism anymore. So then your entire worldview is people using you for whatever personal axes they have to grind. You become cops, you become a snitch line. And on top of that, I mean, that's bad even if everything that you are describing is real, because I think cop-like behavior in general is to be discouraged and is not really constructive and doesn't tend to mitigate harms.
Yeah.
It seems to just promote, I mean, as soon as anyone conceptualizes themselves as a cop, then you're looking for bad guys.
Who's funding them? What do you think is...
Well, I do know that they've received some degree of support from someone. I'm not going to say.
Yeah.
But I know it for a fact. I don't think...
Who has a commercial interest contrary to MAPS protocol being approved?
I'm not sure about that.
Okay.
In fact, I would say the evidence does not support that, which is one of the complicating factors, which is, again, why I come back to this being not like the cartoon version.
Right.
It's more complicated.
But yet when you get to the point of actually fabricating things, which it sounds like Nishay did from what you're describing. So, I mean, I guess there could still be a justification of the ends justify the means, which, yes, maybe I'm taking this thing out of context, but I know that there was so much, horrible, evil shit that MAPS did that, I don't have a potential citation for it that I'm going to use this, because the fact is they're a therapy cult that needs to be taken down, that sort of thing.
Yeah. But then, of course, you've become the very sort of true believer that you criticize, where the ends justify the means at all costs. I mean, this is the irony, is that
there is something cult-like about Symposia.
Of course.
And it pains me to say it.
You could rename your podcast the Rick Doblin is an Evil Rapist podcast. And if you saw him, he would just be like, "Hey, Adam, great to see you. How are you?" Like, that's not cult-like behavior.
Right.
Whereas...
That's great. That's a great point.
There's no us versus that. And I've seen the way Rick interacts with Symposia, a group that has been more or less dedicated to destroying his life's work, and he has treated them with nothing but kindness and understanding.
Well, and even psychedelic science. Were you there at the closing remarks?
Yeah.
Where, a group of people basically rushed the stage, and Kevin, who is producing the conference, was like, oh, let's get them out of here. And Rick was like, no, let's give them the mic. Let's let them say what they want to say. And Rick actually made the decision to turn over the mic at the closing of the biggest psychedelic conference in history to his very upset critics.
Yeah.
Not someone who seemed to be dedicated to shutting down criticism.
And then was criticized for transiently patting one of them on the back.
Oh, really? I didn't hear that. Rick's always been a patter. It's the dark secret of the psychedelic movement.
But the thing is, like, this makes people just miserable and afraid. This sort of behavior, it's not good. It's really not good. It's 100. It's not just a disagreement. This is, I think, indisputably destructive behavior that should not be encouraged. And I've felt that way for a long time. And I think a lot of people feel that way, but they're afraid because any smart person doesn't want to get involved. Any smart person is just thinking, I've got shit to do. I'm not going to get, because you're going to lose. Right?
Well, and even if you win, you're going to lose because a certain number of people, like even if this stuff is disproved, people see headlines and they're, oh yeah, Rick Doblin is a chronic non-consensual patter. That's just, you see the headline, that becomes part of the baggage that attaches itself.
And you're a patter apologist. And somebody who silences criticisms of transient patting on the back.
You minimize the severity of pattism. Yeah, it's right. You've opened up something that you can't really be put back in the bottle fully.
Yeah. And, this stuff is really multifaceted. It's like you have these kind of overarching issues of whether one orients themselves toward fighting for something or fighting against something, where I see so much fighting against and so little fighting for. And that's the feeling that I have. It's like, you don't like medicalization? Fine. I have issues with it too. Fight for decriminalization. You think psychedelics are extremely bad? I mean, I guess it does make sense if they just think psychedelics are extremely bad.
Right.
Like if they're just
cut off everything at the knees, no matter what they're... Yeah.
And this is kind of ironic.
But it doesn't. But I don't think Symposia feels psychedelics are extremely bad.
Certainly, they don't. They claim to not.
Yeah.
Think that, but I've seen them do nothing for drug policy reform or for any constructive initiatives of any kind.
Well, so it changes if you assume, like, okay, they're being extreme in their criticism, and it's kind of like Al Franken, remember? And,
of course.
Yeah. And it was just so heartbreaking. Did he do some fucked up shit? Yes. But to resign a Senate seat and lose a Senate seat, in a closely locked Senate just felt like it was like, the left is eating their own.
Well,
Yeah. So that's how I've kind of viewed it. Symposia is, okay, maybe they're well-intentioned, though at a certain point you have to believe their own shadow shit has to be coming in when it's that, that intense. But yeah, is it serving? Let's keep our eyes on the prize here, which is we all believe that psychedelics are something that can ultimately have tremendous benefit. But what you're saying is that, no, there's actually, when you get to the level of, just outright lying, and I wonder what the motivation is, other than feeling self-righteous feels really good. And it's easier to tear something down than build something up. And it's easier to build an identity opposed to something than for something. And like these fundamental sort of ways of how we construct our identities and our social identities.
And this is also an overarching problem with this cultural moment, which is that there is an inverse proportionality to the magnitude of the crime and how punishable the offender is, where the Al Frankens, they honk someone's breast jokingly in a photo.
I don't think there was actually touching.
No, I don't think so either.
Pretending while she was asleep.
It was
a
mimed.
It was a photo. Yes.
A mimed breast honk.
Yes, a mimed breast honk.
So you mime a breast honk, and you're called out for it, and you say, "I'm resigning from political life. I I am so terribly, terribly ashamed, and I'll, just cancel myself into oblivion for this joke breast honking. Then, and the reason for that is because Al Franken is a good person. So good people are actually more susceptible to this sort of thing than people who are actually bad. And I think that psychedelics as a movement, so many of us believe that psychedelics could promote some kind of positive social change. And so you want to be the change that you want to see in the world. And so you want to be good. And so as a good person, you have to be ultra, ultra sensitive to any kind of impropriety or any kind of badness, because as a good person, you have to be extremely opposed to badness. And that makes you uniquely vulnerable to any kind of accusation because you are trying to present yourself as a good person. And then I think that the flip side of this is that these sorts of attacks are disproportionately ineffective for people that have actually done bad things. So when you compare Al Franken to, like, I don't know if you saw this, it was a New York Times story about it. There was some tattoo artist named Tooth Taker.
I actually did see that. Yeah.
So this guy is like, if the reports are to be believed, the worst person ever.
Has assaulted,
pulled out someone's eyeball. He's a serial rapist. He stole someone's tooth. He tortures people with a tattoo needle. Like, this is like the worst. This is like some kind of Wild West nightmare human.
Yeah.
Yet no one can cancel him. And you look online and everything's like, how is he still tattooing people?
Yeah.
Because he's not pretending to be a good person. He's not
holding out that standard. But I think it's less that people are like, hey, I'm a good person, so I'm going to remove myself. Because thinking back to Al Franken, what disgusted me about it was, of course, there were some Republican calls for him to resign, but the Democratic calls were overwhelming. And I think maybe that's part of it, is if you have a movement that ostensibly is composed of good people, then they want to be, maybe it's less that there's a lot of good people in a movement than there's a lot of people who care very much about being perceived as good. And so if they see a transgression among their own, well, we're going to call that out, as strongly as we possibly can. Where if you have a movement that does not, that being perceived as good is not integral to it, then, and in fact, if you look at like Trump, it's almost a matter of pride that like what he can get away with.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. So he declared bankruptcy 6 times. Good. He fucked over the system. Good. He had these sexual transgressions. Well, so maybe it's less self-canceling than these movements are very eager to jump at the opportunity to show how good they are, even if what that means is canceling one of their own.
Yeah.
And then we get into all the shadow stuff. Why are you so concerned about that? Maybe because deep down, you're not that good, because none of us are that good all the time. And there's this lack of ownership of your shadow. And you can go as far down that rabbit hole as you want, but I think there's truth in that. Not to say that people in this movement are actually deep down less good than other people, but maybe there's more of self-awareness at some level of like, oh, I have these parts of myself that aren't entirely good. And so I'm going to really go hard and call out any transgression in others because I haven't fully owned it in myself, even if I have some sort of inkling of an awareness.
Yeah.
It just seems like there's a very intense fuel behind some of these criticisms, particularly that I've seen from symposia, where, it seems a little one, ignoring the bigger picture of like, hey, this is a good thing that we all want to happen, this approval, and two, just the vitriol behind it. Feels very personal.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it feels very, very personal.
And again, the journalists that amplify this, they either don't know that or they're just clinging to the pendulum of novelty as it swings toward the anti-psychedelic direction. It's none of this is real.
So this whole climate, these various factors conspired, not with any one person orchestrating them, to allow this situation to develop. But yet that doesn't explain that the FDA advisory committee, presumably,
Well, to some extent it does.
Okay.
To some extent. So, I mean, there's so much here. We could talk for 10 hours, and,
Yeah.
and I probably only know half of the reality. But so, Rick's whole thing has always, because he's a good guy, has always been, well, don't demonstrate your worth to the people on your side. You need to convince your opponents. You need to convince the people that are most skeptical. So, he befriended the world's most prominent anti-MDMA neuroscientist, George Riccardi, and allowed him to give him repeated spinal taps to sample his CSF to find evidence of decreased serotonin markers as evidence of...
He sampled Rick's CSF, cerebral spinal fluid?
Yes.
I didn't know this.
Riccardi took Rick's CSF to look for decreased serotonin markers. And Rick did that knowing that Riccardi was the world's most prominent anti-MDMA researcher, because who better to convince than Riccardi?
Right.
Who better to befriend than Riccardi? That's always been his MO. And so Rick is the one who initiated the ICER review. There's a group called ICER that do these...
like these literature reviews? The meta-analysis?
Yeah, with the purpose of... I mean, it's actually funny that these hyper-leftist groups would be aligned with ICER, because their idea is pragmatic to the point of lacking compassion, right? It's about like health years, life years, and discriminates against, for example, treatment of the elderly, because the cost is less,
the benefit of life years extension.
Yes, yeah. So they're very into this. They have there's an acronym that I can't remember for this metric of basically like how well does each dollar translate to a unit of health. And he saw this as the sort of group that you would want to impress. Like these are the people that are going to give the real objective analysis of the efficacy of MDMA. But then after initiating the review, he was barred from communicating with them. So they were looking for information and started talking extensively with Symposia. So if you look at the ICER report, it seems that there is a disproportionate, not complete, but that there's a clear influence of Symposia's concerns on the ICER report, specifically this kind of magnified concern about therapist abuse that I think is not something to be dismissed entirely, but I think has occupied a disproportionately large amount of this discourse. Something that even saying seems like, oh, how can I say that? But it's like, it really is just talked about fucking constantly for something that there isn't clear evidence that it's even a manifestation of the therapy or MAPS protocol. In fact, I think the evidence is very much against that.
Yeah.
So Rick, and this is another example of Rick doing the right thing and getting punished for it. He initiates this review and then doesn't work with them to serve his interests. In this case, not by his choice.
That's just the way they do it when they do a review.
No, I think he was actually barred by Lycos from communicating with them during this review for reasons that aren't entirely clear to me. And the review came out against MDMA. So that was a big part of it. And it wasn't a conspiracy in the sense that Symposia were responsible for the negative assessment, but they definitely were in conversation and informed ICER during this review and played a role in all of this. And when you look at the way that they talk about all of this, I mean, they don't mince their words about thinking that this is an extremely bad thing that should be opposed by any means necessary, or almost any means necessary. So you can imagine how somebody communicating with that group might interpret their input. So there's that. And then...
And did the ICER's report weigh in with the FDA advisory?
It was factored in.
Okay.
And it's kind of hard to precisely characterize what influences what.
Yeah.
Lots of people are talking to the FDA. Obviously, MAPS also had some input in all of this as well. Maybe not as much as they should have, but in terms of the actual review, notably the therapists or the reviewers were not experts in psychedelic research, with the exception of one who voted for it.
The ICER's review or the FDA?
The FDA.
Okay.
Yeah. Only one was someone involved with psychedelic research, and they were the one that approved. So, which you could say, oh, that's evidence of bias.
Sure.
But I think, but this is another kind of issue of the complexity of bias, is that often becoming informed about a subject does entail gaining a bias in some direction. Yeah. It's like almost inevitable.
How are you not going to develop an opinion as you develop expertise on something?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then so, you just see all this stuff like MAPS has initiated this smear campaign against its opponents. There's no evidence for that. And I spoke with the veterans group that was accused of that. They explicitly told me that is not the case, that they're not being paid by MAPS to do this. And it makes, if you just think about it, of course the veterans group is going to be interested, or not, maybe not of course, but it would make sense that they would be organically opposed to the prevention of a VA-sponsored treatment for PTSD with a very serious suicide risk among the group that they advocate for. Same thing for Elon Musk and Dan Crenshaw. Like, Elon Musk has been pro-drug and anti-woke for a long time. He was not being paid by MAPS to say this stuff. It was, again, organic.
Were there accusations that I don't know about that
they'd conspired with Dan Crenshaw and Elon Musk?
Who's Dan Crenshaw?
He's like the eye patch Republican politician who is famously mocked by Pete Davidson. He's like, I don't know. He's a veteran with an eye patch.
I think okay.
I actually don't even really know. He's a Republican.
Yeah.
And he tweeted this video that actually explicitly described Symposia. So they thought that this had been organized by MAPS, and there's no evidence for that. Yeah. And so Jules Evans, who's accusing MAPS of initiating this smear campaign against opponents, is allegedly himself being paid to initiate a smear campaign about an illusory smear campaign. That's how complicated and convoluted these things have gotten. I think people need to really, really start just saying, okay, where's the evidence?
Yeah.
Okay, MAPS initiated a smear campaign. Okay, where's the evidence?
Yeah, and is this level of credulity? It doesn't seem like it's specific to this movement or this space. It's just people read things. You can write anything.
Right, and I provided no evidence that he's being paid by the Sarlo family, for example, or other than saying that a person who doesn't tend to gossip about things like that, who I trust, told me.
Right.
So that should be understood accordingly as well. I'm not making it up, but this is just the nature of these.
Yeah. Wow.
Should we get food or?
Let's get food. Let's wrap this up.
Okay.
So basically, the sort of capsule version is this kind of ultra, I don't want to say virtue signaling, but this increasingly intense concern from various parties about everyone behaving unimpeachably and about everything being done perfectly, and allegations without substance being raised of exploiting indigenous property and all this other stuff against a lot of people. And this has sort of created this climate where it's allowed then these very strong allegations against MAPS, largely coming through people who may have contrary commercial interests or interests that aren't clear, to sort of sow the fields for this kind of backlash. But again, for the FDA itself, so part of it was this ICER's review.
Yeah.
That Symposia was able to weigh in on, and that weighed in on the FDA. But I guess what you're saying is generally there was now this climate already of...
Well, they were also constantly contacting the FDA. They issued a press release,
right.
They issued a statement to the FDA. They were disproportionately represented to an almost puzzling degree during the commentary period. Out of 20 people, 5 of them were Symposia contributors.
I didn't know that. Yeah.
Or maybe it was 30.
Yeah.
But 5 of them were Symposia. I think it was actually 20. So so that's crazy. I mean, imagine if there had been 5 New York Times journalists.
Right.
It would have been, someone would have said, like, this is weird.
Yeah.
Why are there so many people from one group?
So to be clear, you don't feel like necessarily people on the FDA advisory committee have specific undisclosed interests here.
Well, that's an argument that's been made as well, one that I find slightly less compelling simply because anyone involved with the FDA is probably going to have those sorts of conflicts of interest. But people have made that claim as well. Like, oh, don't you see this person who is on the board of Pfizer and they have a treatment for PTSD? There's a bit of that as well. And I mean, Harriet DeWitt was an interesting example where she's an advisor in a company that's developing MDMA as a treatment for PTSD, is involved in the opposition, the notification of concern to the FDA, and then also signs Bob Jesse's statement of support. It's just there's weird stuff going on. And maybe she feels both ways. Maybe she's, like I don't know. This is something that I observed. I actually don't know what to say about. I have no reason to think that Harriet DeWitt is a person of any issue. It's just I saw that she is an advisor in a company that is developing MDMA, and that she was involved in these two contradictory statements.
So I guess the last question is, do you have any sense of what is going to happen now? Because to be clear, the FDA has not rejected this. The advisory committee recommended against approval, but my understanding, and I think the time frame is not long.
It's the 11th.
It's the 11th. Yeah. So a few days from now, the FDA is going to issue a ruling on this.
Yeah.
And so what do you think is going to happen?
It's so hard to make predictions about things like this because rationality is not really part of the equation. Of course, if they were rational, they would approve it.
Yeah.
But the advisory committee's vote was irrational. So if you look at the historical precedent, typically the FDA does side with the conclusions of the advisory committee in the majority, but not all instances. So I am just, maybe I'm an optimist. I think that they will, I just hope that somebody saw that things were being made up, that somebody noticed that Niché was lying and that something weird is going on. I just hope so much that somebody noticed that. And if they did, I hope that it caused them to think very carefully about what they're doing and that they approve it. I think that I guess if I had to bet, I would bet a small amount of money that they will approve it.
Yeah. And do you think it'll be like approved with aftermarket surveillance requirements, or?
Oh, there's already going to be a REMS
That's
program.
going to happen.
Yeah. It's going to be so unbelievable. The idea
a lot of research after
that like kids are going to be, diverting MDMA from this therapy or so whatever, or that people are going to become addicted or whatever.
They have to study every outside possibility of any adverse. Yeah.
But I think they will approve it.
Wow, there's so much more to this than I realized.
Yeah. Oh, I'm just scratching.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the obsession, is like, this frustration of not wanting to, I don't want to say any of this. I feel anxiety. Like already I'm thinking like, do I even want to say any, like, I don't like this. It's going to suck. It's not going to be good for me to say any of this. It's going to be a nightmare. And I very much wish someone else would say this stuff. It's, and so I feel so disappointed that I am forced to say things like that.
So how does the tide turn where actors who seem to be bad actors, who have seized the mantle of the moral high ground, are ultimately called out? But this gets because there's so many ramifications of this. This isn't just about canceling people. This is about canceling a therapeutic protocol that's been brewing for 40 years.
Yeah.
The implications are huge. You could say that people are dying because of this. People with PTSD who have elevated risk of suicide are not going to be able to avail themselves of this treatment, and some of those people who might have been saved won't be saved.
It's certainly an argument that's been made. I myself have chosen not to make that argument simply because it goes in both directions and it is too reminiscent of the exploitation of indigenous people for commercial interests. It's like, Am I really, like, if I'm honest with myself, is that why I really care? Of course, I don't want people to die unnecessarily, but that's not. It is a reason, and it's definitely a reason for people like Julie Holland. Like, there's people that really, really care about preventing suicide in veterans. But you're right. I mean, you're right that
this isn't just
argument can be made that people will die because of this.
Yeah, it's just I'm just appreciating that how much hangs in the balance here. And I'm reflecting on the fact that, it's painful to grapple with this, because it's one thing to look at the situation and be like, well, unfortunately, MAPS they didn't cross their T's and dot their I's properly. It's bullshit, but, the FDA has a way of, like, it's one thing to believe that this is maybe ridiculous, but that it's not wildly unjust, that there's a process that has to be followed that wasn't properly followed, and unfortunately, this is the outcome. But to look at it now, the way that I'm seeing it after this conversation is that, no, people were dishonest, and there was a lot of mendacious stuff put out there, and as a result of that, this may not be approved. And as a result of that, people may die. People will die. And as a result of there's so many for me, part of the thing that was so, was terrifying was like, if this isn't approved, when will psilocybin be approved for depression? This just sets everything back.
Yes, including decriminalization, because that's the other thing. People see these as separate entities or even oppositional entities, which is incredibly naive. That's like, we already learned that lesson with with Marinol. Like, Normal dedicated all these resources to opposing Marinol,
which was the prescription marijuana thing that was available decades ago.
Still is. You just don't hear about it because it's not important, because everyone has access to legal weed, because that whole thing was ridiculous.
Right.
So this is like, when you look back at that, there should be a lesson learned. That was not where the energy should have been applied, and that was actually it's a forgotten chapter because it was so misguided. But it was way more prevalent than people remember. You still encounter that sentiment occasionally with people because it had become a talking point. People totally forget this. Like this isn't medicinal. Marinol isn't medicinal. Only marijuana. They've stripped all of the medicinal aspects out of marijuana. Of course, it wasn't true.
Oh yeah, I didn't know any of this.
THC is absolutely the therapeutic element. I mean, you can make some more. I'm sure many people are having a spit take.
The whole entourage.
The entourage effect. But THC is where the action is at in the cannabis plant.
Yeah.
And they had approved something that was beneficial to people, and it did not stand in the way of subsequent decriminalization and legalization efforts. And it provided a medical foundation on which those efforts could build.
Yeah. Well, I mean, by the time this airs, we'll know what's happened.
Should we bet? No. Or what would you bet? I would bet $45.
Why that? Why $45?
I think that's an amount I feel comfortable losing.
This is the most interesting thing so far in this podcast. Is that
50 would be too much.
So what was the mental process that led to you coming out on 45?
Lower than that seems maybe lacking commitment.
Okay, but 50 feels like
I'm not in the mood to lose $50.
All right, so psychological 45 feels like.
Yeah.
Do I want to bet against you on this?
There's also an intermediate, which is that they provisionally approve, or they mandate like repetition of the.
So like, if you do these studies, then we'll approve it.
That's a possibility, and there's a whole story there why that might end up being the case as well.
Well, it seems so. I know much less about this process than you, obviously, but it seems like politically going against an advisory committee's recommendation seems fraught. If I look at the FDA, if I make the assumption that the FDA is a generally above board organization, so they want to do their mandate, which is approve treatments that are going to help people, but also it's composed of humans who want to cover their asses, and it feels like there's a political risk to approving something that their committee has recommended against approving. On the other hand, there's clearly political pressure that we're seeing from Democrats and Republicans. I mean, I don't remember what the number is, but it was dozens in Congress saying this should be approved. So I would bet $22. That's where it feels right to me.
Against it?
No, I don't.
Yeah, let's not bet then. Yeah,
would I bet against it? No, because I don't want to feel. It'll feel bad if it's ruled against. I want to bet for too, but I guess, yeah, I'm not so optimistic. But I also don't think it's the end of the story, right? Like, I do think the long game is on our side. It just sucks that it could be a long game now. And again, I feel like MDMA personally is not something that does much for me for various reasons. But so stuff I'm more personally passionate. I mean, it's all the same ultimately. It's psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And I'm also interested in psychedelics being approved without the psychotherapy component. But yeah, I want to see this approved. And if this isn't approved, it's bad for everything. So I'm not going to bet, but I will hope that you're right.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to give you $45, but I'm going to hope you're right. All right. Well, I think we can reward ourselves with this very addictive drug of food.
Food, yeah.
Yeah, we deserve it. This has been super. Yeah, I really enjoyed this, and this has been very illuminating for me.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Oof. Yeah.
And we can do a follow up. Let's do a follow up post. After.
That sounds good.
Yeah, when we actually know what happens. Awesome. Well, thank you, Hamilton.